Okay, so basically, I would like to have a little bit a more conceptual talk about comprehensive risk assessment under climate change condition, but I think that adds on nicely to the examples which have been given so far, because as you know, I mean, we are in climate change conditions already. It's not something which is yet to come. And still, there are two disciplines which are dealing with the effects or to reduce the risks related to extreme events. And this is on one hand, the classical disaster risk reduction school, I would say, which is very well established and embedded in civil protection. And there's the climate change adaptation, which is now still often more with the environmental agencies and is more dealing with the gradual long-term effects. But in fact, there is a big overlap, and we see already with these events like Vaia and the one in Germany and Belgium, that climate change adaptation and disaster risk reduction have to come together. And we discussed and worked a lot with, particularly with UNDR in the last year on concepts how to better integrate the two. Maybe one thing which is interesting if you're talking about climate risk in really from the IPCC perspective, risk is defined a little bit different. So it's more vaguely, I would say. So it's defined as the potential for adverse consequences for human or ecological system. But the IPCC at least is not talking about probability of occurrence multiplied by impact. So it's much less probabilistic, of course, because we are talking about climate scenarios, so things where we don't know how likely they are. So actually for the future, we even can't talk about occurrence rates of hazards. And that's, of course, let's say a change in paradigm. So while the classical DRR perspective, which you know much better than myself, is based on return periods, so also risk planning is based on that. The zoning of hazard zones is based on that. In reality, what we see already, like here in this example, so that we have trends which are related to climate change. So the number of flood phenomena with very high severity, for example, increased from the 80s to today significantly. So that means there are still extremes in sense of anomalies from the average, but there is a trend, already underlying trend, and then it's getting simply less clear how, for example, you could calculate return periods, or if this still makes sense. So they're not stationary. We have really also problems with classical indicators, even like things like SPI. So there are so many indicators which are based on anomalies. Anyhow, I think what is done in any type of risk assessment to work with such categories, so like high, medium, low, and they're probably still valid if we base them more on thresholds, and then it's simply a fact that medium and high risk cases will increase in future or are partly already increasing. So this has been a little bit the classical event issue, but of course we have also these slow onset events, as they're called, even if the term event is completely wrong here, such as sea level rise. And also here, of course, so similar to the events, we could indicate some low, medium, high risk levels. So if you have a coastal region, so then you could really say that below a certain level, sea level rise poses no problem, or you are under medium or high risk, particularly if you then add the extreme events such as storm surges. So I think this is maybe the first point here is we are already under climate change, so events are not anymore stationary. Statistic does not work in a linear way. So we have really to change thinking if we can adapt statistics to trends, or if we have to get a bit away from this pure return period thinking when we are defining hazards and risk. And of course, we have to take the slow onset processes, I would call them, into account and see how they are, let's say, even related to the events. Okay, my next point I want to stress when we are talking about climate change. I mean, first, the IPCC took over starting from AR5, so before they used a different concept. So they took over the risk concept. So in general, we are in the same paradigm, in the same school of thinking that most important is not only to focus on hazards, but on risk, which are a function of the hazard, but also of vulnerability and exposure functions. I think you're all aware of that. However, if we look to real climate risks, so this is much more complex than just a function with three variables, basically. And what we have developed over the years, basically, to more or less conceptualize such risk is the concept of impact chains. And this could be the Vaia storm here, so it's not exactly the Vaia storm, but these impact chains almost covers aspects of the Vaia storm. So of course we have a hazard, but often we don't have only one. We have multiple hazards like storm plus heavy rain, like in the case of Vaia. And we have exposed systems. So we have infrastructure, physical assets. We were talking about that, human livelihoods clearly. But for example, ecosystems are often forgotten. So we didn't speak so much so far about the damage on ecosystems of these hazards. And then we have not only multiple hazards, but we have chains of hazards. So heavy rain is triggering landslides, floods, mud flows. We even heard about avalanches. Then we have direct impacts on forest, but then this already triggers other impacts like blocked roads, soil erosion and land degradation. And finally, the social sectors are then affected by sometimes even quite complex chains of events where, for example, let's take this one, so which also happened, by the way, in Germany in this case. So where we have a collapse of telecommunication system, then all your nice early warning apps don't help anymore if you have, if the telecommunication system collapsed. So my point here is, I think we should think complex. And then it's clear that with such a complex system, any probabilistic assessment is probably out of scope. So we cannot calculate the likelihood of a collapse of telecommunication system as a function of heavy rain. So that's simply too much. So again, we should think a little bit more comprehensive, a little bit more complex, particularly under climate change condition. Why? Because vulnerability is so important. So we saw even in the explanations of Benny how important it is where the houses are where the houses are built. What is the land use change, soil sealing, increasing soil sealing posed a lot of vulnerability here. So we should take this strongly into account, particularly under climate change, because, and now I jump about that, because the ways how to reduce the risk related to climate hazards are normally threefold. And I would say the classical way is this one. So to try to mitigate hazards and impacts, which is of course good. But if we look at hazards like the one in Germany, we could really say the options to mitigate the hazards are limited. So we can do that up to a certain level, but it's not endless. And particularly under climate change, I think we have to think much more about that. So to reduce vulnerability, and this includes, for example, risk perception and risk awareness. And maybe one of the last options is to reduce exposure. So that would mean, for example, to move people away from floodplains, which is always the last option. But I think if you think about climate change in Europe, but mainly even beyond Europe, we even have to take such things into account. And these impact chains help to, again, to see and to conceptualize where we could intervene. And then my last slide is, and the last point, so the first where climate hazards are not anymore linear, statistical approaches may fail. The second one was we need to take into consideration complexity and also focus on vulnerability. And the last one is even a little bit more zooming out. So what do we do? So how do we get to a good knowledge on risk and how do we deal with that? And here, my main point is that one. I mean, this is where we want to get to. So informed risk governance. So this is what we want to achieve. Most important that it's not just a rather technical issue to get there, but we also need to talk about objective goals and values. So what do we want to protect? What do we want to avoid? And I think we have to take into account things like the Sustainable Development Goals. So there are other things which are related to hazards besides technical damage or financial damage or damage to infrastructure. And that means, so we have to take into account the goals. We have to take into account the existing policy planning and framework. We have to do a good comprehensive risk assessment, which goes beyond just, let's say, single hazards and probabilistic assessments. This has to be even done in a participatory manner, so with the stakeholders and the affected, let's say, person and systems, and then really lead to rethinking our measures, to implement new measures, and to integrate them into the existing planning and policy framework. yeah, so this is a short, let's say, food for thought, and I hope was inspiring. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Mark. Very interesting. Any question? Benny.
Yes, I was trying to find the right button to raise my virtual hand, but this is quicker. So if you give a more conceptual talk, which I really like, I would like to ask, where does this concept of resilience fit in here? Because resilience is currently the term that is being used in all the major frameworks post 2015, with the Sender framework, in the Paris Climate Agreement, that way around. It's in the Sustainable Development Goals, urban agenda. So what role does resilience play, and how do you define that and coordinate that with the other concepts?
Yeah, no, it's very important. It's a very important concept, and maybe it's really the right answer to this complexity of risks. So I would see resilience also as part of risk reduction. So I mean, this is really just about words. So resilience reduces vulnerability, reduces the risk, and it's definitely the right concept because it's also more comprehensive as the single hazard perspective. So from my perspective, you could put under the way I put informed risk governance, you could even add and increasing resilience, and then I think you would be there.
Okay, thank you very much. Maybe if there are other questions to Mark, it's better to have it now, because unfortunately he has to leave just before 11 for another meeting.
But Massimiliano can also respond to the questions afterwards if there are some in the Q&A session.
Yes, in the discussion we can also follow up on that. Okay, thank you very much, Mark, once more. Now I would love to give the floor to Tiberio Antofie. He's, let's say, working in the European Commission's Joint Research Center, and also is currently management the development of the DRKMKC Disaster Risk Management Knowledge Center, specifically the Risk Data Hub, which is something I think it's very, very interesting. And one of the reasons why I am quite happy to have you here is because one thing that we are still struggling, I think most of our other practitioners are in this particular frame and field, is really to find out systematically the data about impacts, which are so important to really better understand the exact impacting mechanisms that Mark has been talking about, and also try to, as much as possible, quantify this, and especially at the systemic level. So the floor is yours, Tiberio. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I will share the presentation now. Let's see. Where is the share? So I will with this presentation, I will try to answer to some of those issues you raised. Let me see. Do you see something now? Okay, make it big. Perfect. Yes. So I will try with this presentation to answer to some of those. It's a complex subject, right? So as you said, I'm part of the Disaster Risk Management Knowledge Center, and we're developing this tool called Risk Data Hub. It's a web platform, and we, with this development, we try to answer to various policies, directives, strategies, mechanisms, I don't know, deals, with data, with information actually from data. We try to support policy formulation, we try to support policy implementation. And we are trying to do this across different policies, right? That deals not only with disaster risk management, disaster risk reduction, but also with climate, let's say, adaptation. So I'm trying to name here short-term disaster risk and long-term disaster risk, which can be actually answered by reducing vulnerability and exposure in short term, and increase resilience, as was discussed before, if we're talking about long-term disasters. And those are mostly related with climate-related potential impact projected, let's say like this. And yes, this platform tries to answer these, support these actions with data. Of course, you can imagine that disaster data is everything. It's actually everything, and we try to find out which are that information and that data that can be valuable, and that can answer effectively to these actions. And of course, it's coming from different, let's say, domains: statistics, hydrologic research, climate research, land use, for everything in that we are living in, it can become an important information when we are talking about disaster risk. Here I'm trying to show the way we are let's say, categorizing this kind of data. We have a model called risk analysis, which is based on the risk and components of risk. We have a model called disaster loss data, which is the one that I should talk about today, and it's the one that collects disaster from past events. We have research results, which is a way of sharing the output from various research projects across Europe dealing with disaster risk. And we also have a user corner where local authorities can use to store the data, to manage the data under, let's say, credentials that are only theirs, let's say like this. And now a short presentation of this model, then I will pass to the disaster loss data. Risk analysis model is trying to, let's say, answer to this question: what could be lost, where, and due to what? What are we doing here as a key message is to identify the key triggers of risk, no? And they were mentioned also before in the presentations. It's those key and most important, let's say, risk triggers. They are exposure and vulnerability. They are important because they can be easily managed. Mitigation, it's a good one. It's going to take some time to have this in place and efficient, but measures on exposure and vulnerabilities are the ones that are going to reduce the risk. And this is what we try to do mostly in this model across Europe, with open data, with European-wide view. We try to quantify exposure and vulnerabilities. This is something that not only brings up data, but also methodologies, and we try to use this, let's say, in a way that links the local disaster risk with the, let's say, general scale of politics, let's say like this. In the disaster loss module, again, we try to get data. It's everything open source. Put it together. We try to get an overview of what is the losses in Europe based on these open sources. And as I was saying, in research projects or outcome from the research, we have the many projects that we store the data for there. Mainly, I can name this Peseta 4, which is actually quite researched lately, and it's project that with the outcome based on potential or projected impacts from climate, let's say, pathways and socioeconomic scenarios. Now, going back to disaster loss data, it's the discussion today. I will try to give a bit an overview of what we have there, and then name some issues of what we encountered from our experience with disaster loss data from open sources, right? So what we store there? We store their economic losses, we store their human losses, and we store their non-economic losses. This is what we have there right now in the Risk Data Hub. this part here, you might not find it now in the risk data because it was a part of a previous version, but we are going to include it because we are now in a change of technology, and we are going to include it there for sure, but I will go there soon. Economic losses, I say, we are using, unfortunately, open data is not really presenting the economic loss disaggregated per sectors, or insured, non-insured. They just give you a number, and we have to deal with that and work with that and aggregating it to various, let's say, aggregated sectors. And what we use as sectors, it's based on the Sendai indicator. So all the economic losses, they are aggregated in these Sendai indicators in terms of economic losses, C3, C5, based on buildings, based on agricultural losses, based on housing sectors, critical infrastructure. How we do this, we have a model behind it, and we use the exposure in order to disaggregate those 20 million of losses from whatever event. Human loss is the same. We are recording fatalities, affected people, and injured, and we are also using as aggregated information the Sendai targets. The non-economic losses, here we are basing our information on Copernicus. Actually, we try to get, and not only also MODIS, we try to get the impact areas and from satellitary images, and we are connecting this geospatial information, which is like in this case the terms of building, destroyed buildings, not destroyed, damaged, and burned areas in this case across Europe. We are trying to link this information with the tabular data, with the statistical data. How many fatalities was in this burn event, forest fire event? How many economic losses were in this event where these houses were destroyed? So we are trying to connect tabular data, statistical data, recorded data with geographical information coming from these sources, either with Copernicus, which is a part of our colleagues from our unit, or with EFIS, the forest fires, where we get the burned areas. So that would be more or less, of course, once we do this, we go to, let's say, create information from this data in terms of trends, in terms of spatial variability, and in terms of you know, what is the most prone, what is most present hazard in the region, and in terms of impacts. And this information then is used by different users in various ways. I can go there with examples if you want. But that's more or less what we have and what we deal with in the Risk Data Hub. Now, problems, issues. Let's see. Okay, we have, of course, try to assess, is our work useful? Is it good? Is it complete? So we had a survey mainly made on the EUDGs and European institutions, and I can tell you why. The Risk Data Hub was named in the climate change adaptation strategy as the platform to record climate risk data and disaster loss data. And this implies an harmonization or the standardization of the way we structure our platform in order to host data from various sources. No, then this data has to answer to some kind of request. So we said, okay, we are going to make an assessment of our tool. We try to find out what the policies needs, and then with this information we go to a workshop where we include research institutions, universities, industries, everyone that can provide data, and try to link this, as I was saying before, the general scale of politics with the local scale of where the disaster risk happens actually. And we find out that the very unsatisfactory, it's mostly based on terminologies, mostly based on categories, categorization of hazards, categorization of assets, categorization of economic losses. It seems like Sendai target is not the best for some of our data users. So it seems like the way we categorize how we define hazards is not the best way we are doing it. the way we are categorizing assets, buildings, residential, commercial, infrastructure, critical infrastructure was the one that has the worst score. What is critical infrastructure? And it's clear why, because every region, every country has its criticality in terms of infrastructure, which is different from the neighbor region. So this we try to quantify and try to respond in a way to this, let's say, unsatisfactory, let's say, impression of the users. Another one is special scales. We are trying. I will go there in further, and I will go and discuss about things based on our fields in the data. One of the most important aspects when we record the data is to give it the impact data or disaster loss data is to give it an ID. And the event code is the one that gives that. I mean, we were talking about the low pressure core Brand in Germany. I would really be curious to know how it's called across Europe. This part of event code ID, it's the one that most reflect the problem at the level of windstorms. In Finland, they might be called in a different way. In a way, across Europe, it might have the name Dharma. I don't know. So this event code is the one that answer give the solution. The glide number is not the one that was accepted because it's so general, it cannot be linked to the local and small events. What we do in the risk data is use a special, use the hazard event code, hazard abbreviation, the name of the country, the date, and a generic number. It's still not enough because, as we were saying in presentation before, the impacts are across border. They are not confined within a nation. So we need to find a way to generate an event code that goes across borders like this. Then we have some ideas. We will see how we get there with that work. Then the impacts, they have a location. We are storing the risk data based on the NUTS 3. We aggregate all the losses, fatalities, economic and NUTS 3. There are many reasons why. One of them is also the EU solidarity funds, because it's based on assessment done at administrative units. We found out that of course it's not enough. We have users that they need losses aggregated at the level of hydrological basins. We have users that they, from the industries, that they need aggregation at the level of cresta. It's another way of dividing the administrative across Europe. Other users, they want pinpoint exact lat long. Okay, we need to implement. That's some issues. With the data from other sources, we try to get them at least NUTS 3 level. The dates, of course, we use that they only need the yearly data, they only seasonal data. That's why the best way to do it is just record it as daily, at least. We don't go to hourly level, but daily level, the event has to have a date there. Then we go to what is a phenomenon and what is an event. Now that's another issue for us. For us, for example, we confine the event within a country border. That's it. This is what we do. And we try to have a temporal buffer of 7 days. For example, if in Lombardia, 5 fatalities we have for the flood on a certain day, and 5 days after in Calabria we have 10 more days. For us, these two are two phenomena over the single event. If we talk about the same hazard, of course. But then how this is okay, looking at how the insurance companies they use the hourly clause, and they use the 168 or 7 days, I think, temporal, let's say, time in order to distinguish between different events. But there are many other ways of doing it. We, as I was saying, we confine the event by this rule of temporal buffer and by hazard and by country. Then another important is and I will talk already about this, the metric. No, the impacts, we aggregate them, as I was saying, at the level of Sendai, but this is not enough because some users, they need the losses aggregated at the level of economic sectors. So they need industry, they need impacts on manufacture, they need the impacts on health in the system, like for example. This is why with the work we are doing right now, it's based on defining the impact as a physical damage and as of a structure, be it building or infrastructure, and as a service that this infrastructure, that structure is providing. So we try to divide these damages and losses in these two ways, and these services, we are basing them on the economic activities in Europe or the NACE, the NACE codes. So we are trying to use those and map those activities against the structures in order to find a way of satisfying different users with different needs in terms of quantifying the losses per sector. Also, what we are missing the risk data is really needed right now. It's to make a distinction between what is insured and what is not insured. This is from the open data. We don't have it, but we are preparing the platform to have this also present there. Then, how do you quantify the currency of the economic losses? Because from the open source data, we have euro, we have dollar, we have local currency. So what is the best way of storing the data? We are actually right now storing the data in the currency, that the local currency, and then further analyses are done to convert them to euro and to convert them to include the inflations and bring everything up to a level of 1 year 2019, for example, considering inflation and deflation. That would be the solution for this. But anyway, these are some of the issues we encountered, because of course this is not all of them. I might have also forget some of them. One most important thing: what makes you register an event in a database of disaster loss data? Because it might happen that there is a huge event but is no losses, but you want them in the database because it's important to have it. Some of the approaches are based on the early warning systems. I mean, if an early warning was provided, that event should actually be included in the database, even if at the end it had no losses. Another issue is, do we put a threshold for the losses when we put them in the risk data? Should we only register more than 10 fatalities event? Should we only register more than 5 million losses in that? We believe that this is the threshold is not a good issue, because frequent events with small amount of losses, they are important, especially at local level, when they have to deal with the high probability, low impact events, which is something that can happen at the local level quite frequent. So this threshold, we are not going to use it there. For example, I don't know if I have something else that I can remember, but anyway, right now, what we are doing in the Risk Data Hub is to consider all these issues and to have the possibility to store data across Europe, considering these important aspects which were driven by the users of our data, which is, as I was saying, open data. We did what we could do with this open data. So that's it for me as a conclusion. First line here is most important. It's just a template Risk Data Hub for collaboration. We're developing here a platform that can host data. It's open source. It can be installed on local servers. It can be used with a credential already. But it's most important is not about having data here. It's about collaboration. It's about networking. It's about discussing about these things as more as possible. And then, as I was saying, this is the work we are doing right now, and we are trying to do our best, trying to get as many possible involvement from many sectors including industries, industries, universities, research centers, and users like policy DGs. No, and thank you for inviting me here. And if you have questions, I'm here to answer. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tiberio, and thank you for a great job. I think it's very relevant, very important, and as you say, collaboration is key to really further advance this very nice job of the RDH, into more and more practical disaster risk reduction related applications.
Yeah.
Is there any question from Tiberio? I would have some, but perhaps what I would suggest is to go on with the last contributor, and then we can have, let's say, a bit more of a discussion later on. So thank you very much once more. And next, last but not least, is Gaetano Vivo. He's the team leader, team leader in the European Commission's Directorate for the European General Civil Protection and Humanitarian Operations, so DG ECHO. And he's also a manager of a program of grants for disaster prevention and preparedness, which I think is very much in line with the scope of current workshop. So the floor is yours, Gaetano. We would like very much to hear the DG ECHO and the European Commission view on this topic. Thank you.
Yeah. Can you see the presentation?
Yes.
Let me. Okay. Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Massimiliano, and thanks to the TRANS-ALP project for inviting me to present on behalf of DG ECHO. As you said, Massimiliano, I'm a team leader in DG ECHO for the Prevention and Preparedness program. I believe most of you are aware with the UCPM, the Union Civil Protection Mechanism is. Just in a sentence, is our framework of cooperation in Europe for disaster prevention and preparedness and response. As you may know, our biggest competence is to support response to disaster. Our biggest competence as EU is to support response to disaster and crisis that overwhelm the capacity of a country, of a member state. But we have as a competence also to complement the role of member states in prevention and preparedness. So this is important to say because in terms of financing, in terms also of the legal instrument that we have in the Union Civil Protection Mechanism to strengthen preventions all over Europe may not be the same as the means and the legal instruments we have to respond. Unfortunately, they're not as strong as for response. This being said, I think we do not really need a reminder. In this audience, we're all aware of the impact of disaster. Just perhaps, if you allow me to put the accent on the economic impact of disasters, which is an area that inside the Union Civil Protection Mechanism has not been looked very in depth in the past years. It's been 20 years, by the way, that this mechanism exists, but we are now looking more and more at this dimension. 12 billion is the average cost that disaster have had in Europe annually between 1980 and 2020, so over the past 40 years. More or less, I was looking at some figures. It corresponds to the same amount that the EU invests every year in research and innovation. It's a huge amount of money, and that's an average figure. As we know, there's some reminders here on the screen, and the Serbia floods of 2014, which almost totaled 5% of the GDP of the country. The Croatia earthquake. I know that the focus is on hydro-meteo hazards today, but an example of a disaster that happened within another disaster when the country was in the middle of the COVID response and a huge economic toll, almost 10% of the GDP, even though it was a very localized, a relatively localized earthquake. So disasters are increasing, climate change, we're all aware of that, but also the economic price to pay is becoming higher. So here, in terms of the context, just if we want to be very a bit simplistic, but just to summarize the three big trends that we see in this context where we operate at European level, and I realize that here we are moving. If the first presentation was at 1,000 feet, now we are at 30,000 feet, but perhaps interesting also for you to have the broader perspective of how we see things from Brussels. We see that unfortunately the big bulk of investments are for responding to disasters, in spite of I think it's been since 2005 with Yogo framework and then all the following conventions and agreements, but we're still very much in a responsive posture. We have a clear problem in estimating the benefits of investing in prevention. And by that, you will see that in the later slides, but to go beyond the avoided damage and losses caused by disasters, so the other opportunities that investing in prevention can bring. And thirdly, we see underestimate of the capacity for our financial instruments, and I don't only refer to the national level, reserve funds, contingency funds at national level, but also at the EU level, so solidarity fund, to really face the next big ones, that next big events that we may have. So this is on the challenges side. On the opportunity side, we have seen COVID and all the huge challenges that this has posed to Europe, but let's try to be optimistic and look at it on a positive side and see that we have an opportunity. We have an opportunity that first was set by the European Green Deal, which is, as you know, it's an extremely ambitious plan to support green finance and climate financing, and therefore there are huge amounts there for investments. There has been, after COVID, the Resilience and Recovery Facility, which is this additional recovery plan for Europe. There again, a huge financial opportunity. We just need now to connect the evidence and the knowledge with the financing, and possibly in a way that looks at these three aspects, these three pillars, in a combined way. We need to look at investments, so we need to look at physical resilience. We need to look at finance, so we need to look at basically have enough cash in our accounts to face the next big ones, and we need to look at capacity. So we need to look at civil protection in particular for us in DG ECO, because civil protection are our main counterparts. Although, as we know, disaster is a business for the whole government. What we did with the World Bank, we meaning DG ECO, but it's actually a European Commission-wide initiative that produced the study that slide that was a moment ago. So those three pieces of a study called The Economics for Disaster Prevention and Preparedness, which is available online, is a joint work. I was saying commission-wide. It's led by DG ECO, but work closely with several departments of the European Commission, starting with the JRC. You may be aware of the PESETA study, which is an important milestone in Europe for the assessing the impact of climate change. The Economic and Financial Affairs, ECFIN, very interested in these topics. The DG Regio, Structural Funds and Solidarity Fund. We had DG Environment, flood directives, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. And DG Klima with the recent EU adaptation strategy. We had really the key actors in the Commission behind the study. And what the World Bank team did, this is a project that lasted a year, so relatively short time frame, building on some of the work already existing, so PESETA, but also commissioning a regional, so a Europe-wide assessment of floods impact. And that, one of the challenges I'm sure Tiberio and others working in this area are familiar with, is the consistency of the data. It's not easy to have a Europe-wide assessment of floods or earthquakes, but trying to model that with using a probabilistic model provided by JBA, which is a private company for floods, and the GEM for earthquakes. So only looking at 2 of the many potential hazards that we have in Europe, we start looking at a bit what are the figures, what are the worst case scenarios. And okay, here you see just a compounded effect of these 2 risks, again in terms of economic impact, the annual average losses, and so looking at only at these 2 risks, these 2 hazards, from a financial point of view, looking, trying to understand what are the consequences of this. In other words, what does it mean for governments? Because governments are the ones who are actually going to bear the brunt of these disasters for the most. And someone earlier was referring to the insurance coverage, which is very diverse and scattered in Europe. I'm not going to read all these figures, but just perhaps a couple of points. So up to 17% of GDP for some member states, and we're only looking at floods and earthquake, so two hazards, so without modeling all the possible hazards and combinations of. Then other figures that really caught our attention is this 96% at the end of that is the gap, basically the amount, the liability, so the potential losses that are not covered by any layer of protection, meaning national budget, emergency budgets, insurance, so private sector, solidarity fund. So it's a huge amount that every year risks to be covered by ad hoc financing. And when we say ad hoc financing, we mean redirecting budget of the government that from other priorities, such as education, health, or others, have to go into recovery and reconstruction, or increased taxation, or other, let's say, unpopular measures. So there's a huge risk there from the financial level. And another also, always here in terms of headlines, because we don't have enough time, but every year there is a 10% chance in the EU that there will be a combination of earthquake and flood severe enough to exhaust all financial reserves, including the Solidarity Fund. And some of you may have read in the news, in the past couple of weeks, that the Solidarity Fund is indeed struggling to cover the German, the losses from the German floods that took place this summer, because it's an instrument that is limited, and therefore, my next slides, we have to look at new instruments and new ways to top up these financial instruments. We are still, in a way, thinking a little bit backward, and looking at with the previous century approach to disaster risk management. We have to look at new possibilities to, introduce financial instruments that can provide additional ceilings of protection in case we face the next big one. So very strong interest in this from our colleagues from DG ECFIN, the Economic and Financial Affairs, the ministers of finance of Europe, who of course are very much aware of this, of the impact on the financial, on the fiscal and macroeconomic, balance of Europe. But finance is only one aspect. As I said, there are 3. So finance, physical resilience, and capacity. So let's move to the second one. And I'm sorry, I realize I'm taking a bit more time, but the second aspect is the physical resilience. So the cost benefit, the famous cost benefit the analysis for investing in prevention, and the economic argument for promoting investment in resilience. So here we have traditionally we read a lot of figures. €1 spent saves $7, $9, $10, $12 or euros in response. We wanted to have a little bit of evidence, of fresh evidence, and also Europe based. So what we asked the World Bank is to look at a number of investments, so 74 investments covering several types of hazards across Europe. So really to have a Europe-specific examples, and to give us a little bit of evidence on what are the benefits and how do they compare to the cost. So good news is that in almost all cases, the benefit to cost ratio is one or more. So that means that the benefits exceed the cost, but that in some cases the benefits can be much higher than cost, and that is the case when we combine, when we conceive investments that address several hazards at the same time. The typical example is the structural reinforcement of buildings, where you tackle the seismic strengthening and the energy efficiency, or flood protection measures that, in addition to have engineering element, also have early warning and soft nature-based solution and other non-engineered solutions. So you see here, for example, that for floods, which is the topic of this meeting, the median is 5. So 5 times the benefits are 5 times the cost of investment when it comes to flood protection measures that incorporate this smart investment. So here we have plenty of examples. I'm not going to go into that, but the big for us in the Commission, the new aspect of this is the importance of looking beyond the avoided losses. So the number of lives that you can save, the number of reduced damage that would not have, that you would avoid if in case that disaster would happen, but to look at 2 other layers of benefits that materialize even if the disaster does not happen, because this is the biggest problem we have, and I'm sure that many other of you that work at national level, at regional level, and municipal level, they share the same problem, is that prevention, unfortunately, it's a very hard to sell, and remains very hard to sell at all levels. And in spite of all the disaster that we have faced and that we have seen even today, it continues to be very hard, because the benefits of preventions are difficult to communicate, because they happen after 5-10 years, if they happen. And therefore, we need to look at this, second and third layers of unlocking economic potential, so increased value from prevention or intervention, increased value of land, increased value of building stocks, and co-benefits. In terms of environment, in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, etc. The third and last pillar of this new approach that the World Bank and ECHO study has included is on capacity. So here it's mainly feedback coming from the national level, because our counterparts are national civil protection authorities. But I think some of these findings, which I've summarized here, it's a very short summary for this third part of the study, also concern regional and municipal level civil protection. So we have an issue of finance and resources. It's still, as I was saying, remains very difficult to convince our decision makers to invest in prevention. The opportunity here is that we need to raise awareness, and there are more and more interesting and engaging ways to do so. I think the colleague from Germany earlier had a very nice example in terms of flood risk awareness. We also need and have now more evidence, numbers, figures, which should hopefully talk to our decision makers, to our budget ministers, so such as the ones I showed earlier. So that's on the first high. So really advocating for investing. The second point is on the institutional framework. We all know this, but unfortunately, this is another critical aspect of prevention. We are not looking only at emergency services here, but when we look at prevention, we're looking at several ministries, at several sectors of the government at all levels, including at European level, and that's really challenging. So coordination between sectors. And third, this issue of technical and human capacity. So one thing that actually came out from this consultation with 14 member states. So the member states themselves, the civil protection themselves recognize this, is that there is a shortage of people in the CP authorities working on prevention, because these agencies, what they do, unfortunately, is to move from one emergency to another, and that's not absolutely not to blame any agencies, just because this is the nature of their business in a way. And so this basically causes staffed prevention department within civil protection and big technical gaps, because the prevention is also a complex matter. You need science, you need to feed knowledge from several fields, from environment to infrastructure to health, etc. So just in a nutshell, these are the three takeaways of this study. Investing in disaster resilience makes not only economic sense, but there is even additional contribution to growth, to economic growth, that can come from investing in prevention. We need to think before disasters happen of financing line, credit lines that can help us face the big one, because we face the risk of running out of money, basically. And all of this does not make sense without capacity building, without investing in our people in the region, at national and regional level. Now, I know I'm a little bit late, so I'll move directly to, we come to perhaps the 10,000 feet level now. What we do in my team, we manage, among other things that we do, we manage grants for prevention and preparedness. TRANS-ALP is, by the way, is a project that is financed by our program. We are very proud of seeing projects like this one, and to see also the amount of knowledge that they help us share. So bravo, kudos to the organizers. But we also work with national civil protection authorities directly through a program called Track 1, where we basically provide grants to civil protections to get technical assistance from private sector, from their own research community. They are free to choose. It's a very flexible program. They can get grants from us to prepare investments, so connected to my previous part of the presentation, to prepare strategies, plans and documents. For instance, Croatia used a grant, or Greece is using such a grant to prepare the national disaster risk management plan, or to just manage the knowledge, good practices that they have at national level. So this is, as I said, targeting national authorities, although there is a possibility for regions, so sub-national level, to be involved in these grants. They're mainly made for national authorities. So far we have, it's a relatively new program. We started in 2019, and it's been very successful, which demonstrates also one of the conclusions of the study is that there is a need to bring more technical capacity to civil protection authorities in the area of ex-ante disaster risk management. So we have provided several grants for being a very young program, and we are hoping to continue to do so. So these are just some of the examples. As you see, our mechanism is broader than the member states. Though we also include countries which are not members of the EU yet, such as Montenegro, Turkey, and so you have different type of projects. Some are financing strategy, national strategies. Other countries have already an idea of for example, Latvia requested our grant of Track 1 to develop to design their national early warning system. So in some cases, they have already an idea of a very discrete investment they want to prepare, and then they will use these studies, this technical specification, to go to the structural funds and get the money to actually do it. So there can be interesting synergies there happening. And then last on Track 2. So Track 2 is this cross-border. So while Track 1 is a single country, Track 2 helps this peer-to-peer, horizontal exchange of information, such as TRANS-ALP project. We try to promote this exchange between countries, and we have this is a very old program in the mechanism, but we are trying to revamp. We provide, you can see the average grant is it's about 600,000. 2-year projects. We bring together different countries, and this is really a broad program. So you have municipalities, regions, private companies. Everybody can be part of this. Last slide is looking forward. What are we learning from all this knowledge that I mentioned? So we had also, by the way, a recent evaluation of the Track 2 program, and for Track 1 we are basing ourselves on the conclusion of the study with the World Bank. We need more evidence from the benefit cost ratios I showed earlier. Some of these figures we hope, and from what we see, they really are piquing the interest of many stakeholders, not only at European level, but also at national level. We need to provide more of this technical support to civil protection authorities. We would like to explore how we can go to the subnational level, but this is a little bit of a challenge for us because our mechanism is a mechanism made of member states, of national agencies, authorities, but we are aware that there is a demand at a regional level, and we will try to work with the national level in order to reach also the level beyond, level under the national, so the regional level. And we also aware that more and more civil protections are a bit lost in this sea of funding that is available. I mentioned earlier the Resilience and Recovery Facility, where there is a specific pillar for green and climate investment. The Green Deal brings the billions for investments that go in the sense of climate change adaptation and reduction of emission. There's also just the regular MF multi-annual framework of the EU with the structural funds. CP authorities are small traditionally, and they're not traditionally very strong in preparing investments. So often there is a gap there, to bridge between the CP and the Ministry of Finance, the Ministry of EU Affairs. And I don't know, it would be interesting to know if this situation also happens at regional level or it's only at the national level. Moving to the cross-border program, we are seeing that we need to do really more to share the results of our projects. We are aware that we have a very rudimentary search engine on our website, and that we're hoping now that with the knowledge network that will be launched soon, we can modernize a little bit in DG ECO our catalog of project outputs. I mean, projects such as TRANS-ALP, but we have several of projects where we really see different parts of Europe, regions, from different countries, but they share similar risks, that work together, that share good practices. We need to make this more visible. Working as much as possible on a common results framework, because we have within the mechanism also we do a lot on exercises, training, and then we have these projects. We are trying now to sit down together with colleagues from the exercise and training and see if we can have a common results framework where we can really contribute to the same goals and measure this impact. And then the end users, I think, well, this also goes without saying. They are the starting point. They should be the starting point for this project. So there's no way to involve them only at the end. We have to make sure that they're involved since the beginning. And yeah, just let me leave you with a little cartoon. I think we all experienced this. We are often, unfortunately, fighting disasters that already happen, and we are not looking at the disasters that will happen tomorrow, which will be completely different from the one that we dealt with yesterday. And this means also that sometimes for us, even working in this at the European level, is not easy to find the resources for exactly that, for looking at the new scenarios and the new disasters that have not yet happened. Thank you very much. Thank you, Massimiliano and the team. And again, congratulations for such an interesting meeting.
Thank you very much, Gaetano. You were very comprehensive. You started at, flying high at 10,000 feet, but then you landed just on spot, I would say. I would suggest, since we are a bit beyond schedule, that we can, let's say, jump any other break, and we can just open the floor for any question to Gaetano now, but also to the other speakers, and have a good quarter of hour of discussion before heading to a well-deserved lunch. So is there any question for Gaetano right now, or anyway, feel free to jump in the discussion. To break the ice, I would have okay, we have Piero first.
Yes, thank you, Max. Well, I was waiting a bit because the question is not really for Gaetano, so I was waiting to see if there were questions for him. I just had my initial question to Gianni, so maybe, I don't know if I can start with that if you want.
Yes.
Yes. Okay. So the question was for Gianni, but that can also apply to Paola, I think. So, Gianni, you quickly talked about the successful prevention measures that you applied in the Agordino Valley. I was a bit curious to know a bit more in details what were those measures. I understand that they are probably very short term, almost like coping with the imminent event. I think that maybe, or are you also talking about like more long-term prevention measures? And yeah, so if you could go a bit more into detail about this, and also maybe Paola, if there are similar measures in the Lago di Como area. And then finally, also a short comment on the presentation of Benny and his proposal for like positive risk awareness. I think it's I give a +1 to that, and I think it's an important factor also to work on the well, first of all, yeah, positive knowledge awareness, and also to work on the local communities, like concerts and like having, you know, sort of fun. It's a really important factor to like make the people feel part of his own local community. That's an important factor. So it's a good idea also. Thank you.
Okay, I try to answer shortly, as short as possible. Okay, the prevention measures concerning Vaia had a particular story, we can say, because in the previous days, 3 or 4 days before the arrival of Vaia storm, there was a big fire in the Agordino, okay, with the fan condition, too dry condition, and a big fire in woods. So the local civil protection authorities were working, okay, about the fire. So we start working about the weather forecasting concerning mainly wind and visibility conditions, low clouds and similar, to manage the fire. But day by day, we could see that there was a very important meteorological event coming. And so we started to alert the local civil protection. And I think it was really important that the local civil protection was strictly connected to the regional civil protection. So the regional civil protection authorities starts to move in advance. So I think we have to thank the regional civil protection to believe in our weather forecasting, to understand that we were going to live a probably dramatic event. Okay, so not only the regional but the national civil protection structures were activated in advance. Okay, at least on Monday the 29th, that was the day in which we were waiting for the crossing of the final and deepest low pressure center with the cold front, and the day in which we were waiting for the most intense part of the event, especially in the Belluno province. There was a really another important decision by the local civil protection authorities, the prefetto, okay, of Belluno, which decided to believe again to the weather forecasting, which were predicting very intense rain and very strong winds, and he decided to take the decision to close all the job activity in the province at 12. public and private. Okay, and so in the afternoon, evening of the Monday, no one was out of the house. Okay, a lot of damages, but fortunately, a very, very low number of person. Okay. Okay.
Yes, thanks.
Thank you.
Benny.
Thank you. Thank you very much for giving me a +1 for this positive framing of raising risk awareness and preparedness, or fostering preparedness. I think this is really a very good idea to keep in mind to how we can develop our risk culture. For example, when I was a child, we had these village festivals, and they always took place, and they were always organized by the firefighters. And when I was a child, of course, I loved it to be allowed to play with this big fire hose to shoot around, and you could get some points and stuff like that. And this brings people to civil protection and to firefighting and as a volunteer. And this is very important. But just there are, of course, many other examples of what you can do to increase risk awareness and foster preparedness in such a fun way. Just recently, the Federal Office for Disaster Assistance here in Germany produced a cookbook. There was a competition, send in your best blackout recipes. What can you cook if there's no electricity? And then the local firefighters here in Bonn, where the federal office is located, and also the other organizations, Red Cross and so on, they had to test all the recipes, and then they decided which are the best ones and which will be printed in the book. And now you can buy the book with blackout recipes, and I really love that. Other examples are, of course, serious games where we have developed one, and well, basically 3, but one is in a really nice box and nice playing cards, and you can really put serious topics in a gaming environment and have people play with each other and let them deal in a fun environment with a serious topic, so that they get to know each other, exchange ideas, and also understand the problems that others have. So because dealing with uncertainties is something that scientists might be familiar with, but in administration, that's probably something else. So just to give some more ideas what you could do. Thank you.
Thank you, Benny. Any other question or comment? By the way, I was surprised, Benny, to hear, if I understood well, that one of the big problems also is related to the use of basically ensemble modeling for hydrological, and this is really interesting because usually we really see from the scientific perspective the use of ensemble as a really a cool way to capture the uncertainties. But if this is not done in the right way, that can just add confusion and really even at a certain extent prevent civil protection authorities from really being, let's say, on spot on taking the right decision at the right time. So that is quite an interesting point to be addressed.
Yeah, they are already using ensemble modeling. Of course, they are using a lot of different input data, and they run the model with a lot of different data sets. And then, of course, they get many different results. And they are normally in these forecasts, when you communicate to the general public or to decision makers, you would normally try to not include the range of uncertainty, because a mayor either has to decide, this is an emergency, let's call it a disaster, and let's get help from the national level. But if there's a range of uncertainty telling you it's either 3-meter water level or 9-meter water level, what do you do then? As a mayor, probably not coming with a scientific background, you are overwhelmed with that. How can you make decisions with such an uncertainty? And I mean, as a scientist, you are used to that, but it's difficult to communicate, and it's difficult to understand for people who are just there to make decisions for others. And so yeah, it's good to run the model with many different inputs and then create many outputs, but uncertainties are terribly difficult to understand for other people outside of science. And I think we have to acknowledge that, and yeah, probably reflect a little bit on how we communicate scientific results.
Definitely. Tiberio.
Hi, again, a question for Benny, okay, with this event in Germany. Because from my understanding and looking around and having colleagues working on this issue, the science did the job. The early warning system did the job. There was a problem with the response. Can you make us understand what was the problem? Because this could be a nice, let's say, example, nice learning example from what happened, that what science predicted, and I'm talking about EFAS here, was not really considered or was not really applied in terms of response at the level of many institutions and many structures that had to deal with this.
So, of course, there were forecasts several days in advance that there might be a major flood, but you have to understand what is a major flood. If your horizon of what it could be the maximum is a 30-year event, which they considered an event 1 in 100 years, it's of course difficult to make the right decision. Of course, they were aware of that there, and also the modeling that takes place within this Our Valley, so in the state of Rhineland-Palatinate. I always think Palestine, but in RLP, that's the short version of it. They were of course aware of that, and they produced very, very similar results. But they are using additional models, of course, because they are modeling just single rivers as well, and so on. So there were different forecasts for the rain based on radar measurements, and at some point, some of the forecasts, and there are not just one forecast every, I don't know how often they do that, but there is always a set of forecasts that they were provided with, these modelers. And in one of the radar measurements or forecasts, I'm not entirely sure, there was a change, and the position of the most heavy rain band moved a little bit, and that influenced the forecast of the river flood. And then suddenly it was not 5 meters something, but it was again 4 meters something, and they thought, oh, we can deal with that. Then at the same time, apparently, where in this room where the decision about a disaster case had to be made, there was the prime minister of the state in the room, but he just left after the forecast was again raised. And you know, the forecast might have been completely correct based on the data, but if you look at early warning system, it's not a technical system, it's a social process of communication. And yes, the forecast was right, but again, in the end, it's the decision maker and it's the communication. Of course, it was not only that they were too late calling it a disaster. Also, they didn't have any good advice what to do. When they, it's not everything that I'm saying here is not peer reviewed yet. It's all a bit, I heard it here and I read in the press, I talked to the mayor. You cannot completely rely on what I'm saying here, but it's just what I have heard so far. So there was, for example, the case that we do not have as many sirens as we used to have during the Cold War time, because we had this feeling nothing can happen. But when they turned on the sirens, the flood was already so loud and so big that some people reported they didn't hear any sirens at all. Then there was this, you have to evacuate. At some houses, people were sitting on the roofs, whereas in 2 villages down the river, they were still told to get some stuff out of the basement. That doesn't fit together. Then there was this evacuation order. They were not aware, apparently, that's what I think, of the risk maps. And they were told, okay, evacuate 50 meters right and left from the river. These houses must be evacuated. But this house that I told you about, where 12 disabled people died, it was more like 250 meters away from the river. So completely inadequate what they told them. They were not familiar with such an event. They could not estimate what could happen. And how can you expect anyone to react in an appropriate way if they do not know what to expect? So I'm really not blaming anyone here. Even this mayor person who is probably maybe going to jail for that because of neglected manslaughter or however they call that. I'm not pointing the finger at him because how could he estimate what could happen? I mean, it's a forecast, and the forecast jumped for a meter in one between two different forecasts due to a move of the rain band. It's all terribly complicated, and I really recommend not looking at single segments of the warning chain, but to zoom out a little bit and to look at the entire warning chain, starting with the instrumentation. All the instruments, of course, were completely destroyed long before the strongest wave of the flood. Because the instruments were just being washed away. Then look at how information or how the data is being transmitted, how different forecasts are being integrated, how in particular decision making takes place, how warnings lead to advice to different stakeholders, to rescue forces, to firefighters, to the general population. There are so many issues, and zooming in too much and looking just at the forecast doesn't pay respect to the big challenge of a long warning chain. And of course, every chain is only as strong as the weakest part of it. So look, I think we should look at the entire chain of this early warning system. And because the chain failed, it's not just one segment. There were many issues, many things that we can learn, and to say it in a more positive way.
Thank you, Benny.
If possible, I'd like to remark something of the Benny speaking. In my opinion, in these cases, the human component of the chain of prevention is fundamental. As I told in the answer I gave before, we had to explain to civil protection authorities the meaning of our forecasting, okay? And they got convinced that it was maybe real, okay? Because the weather forecasting is a number. 600 millimeters of rain is a number. But what I can remember concerning this forecasting was my colleague speaking. He was involved in the weather forecasting in the day before the coming of Vaia. He told me, I've ever seen a so intense vertical up motion of air. That means that maybe we have we are speaking about an exceptional event. We have to transmit this information. We have to get it real to the authorities, okay? Because the models could be right or wrong, okay? And if you have uncertainty, it is more difficult. But if the forecaster, in this case, has the conviction that you are expecting an exceptional event, you have to transmit this idea. And this is a human component of the chain.
This information, 600 millimeters of rain, is something that I feel very comfortable with. But if I told that to my grandmother, for example, 600 millimeters, oh yeah, how much is that? What's the effect? That's the basic question. What does it mean? If you, instead of saying 600 millimeters of rain, you should probably say that's the biggest flood event that you will ever see in your life. Probably this is easier to understand for them. But we have to translate this information to every recipient of the information. And also a mayor, I mean, how many of them have a PhD in meteorology or stuff like that? They are not used to work with numbers like that. They are probably more familiar with budgets or so, but if you say 600 millimeters, it's rather meaningless to some people.
No, yes, but 600 millimeters is the first information of the chain of the forecast. Okay, we transmit to our authorities and to our technical colleagues, which have to translate 600 millimeters in effect on the soil. Okay, then all this information have to be explained to people.
Thank you, Gianni and
Okay.
Benny. Maybe one question from Fabio.
Hi to everyone. No, it's just a comment. Yeah, following what Benny just said. I think that risk culture could be really an important aspect, but we have to define it. What is risk culture? So is this having a complex thinking, being risk aware, knowing perfectly what is a hazard, or I don't know, being able to address uncertainty? What is risk culture? Because risk culture can be also really, not can be, must be really context related, and so every different actors could or must have a different risk culture. So we have, I think it's really a key to be addressed, but I think maybe we have to define it. And second thought is why risk communication, risk awareness, risk perception has not been yet at the center of disaster risk reduction. Maybe we have to act on risk culture at really different levels. So at all the risk governance level. So what kind of risk culture does decision makers have? Can we improve also risk culture at all the different levels in order to act more on the on risk culture and risk awareness at all levels? And the third thought is the presentation by ARPA and by Benny made me thinking how much linked can be seismic risk to extreme event risk. So in case of earthquake, we don't know when, we don't know the intensity. We know some areas, and we can do really a lot more on physical vulnerability or on risk awareness than on other issues. So I think there are a lot of similarities between extreme events and earthquakes, and maybe we could learn a lot from the seismic risk literature, and bringing together the two risks to increase our knowledge and also preparedness. Okay, that's all from my side.
Thank you, Fabio. This is also a thought that I had as well. I think there is a really striking resemblance between the type of event, for instance, that happened in Germany, and let's say kind of a mid-sized earthquake as can happen in Italy, with let's say much more frequent let's say probability, by the way. So I think it is really interesting, this point, with the difference that with the big difference that in the case of floods, the early warning is let's say a much more practical solution than in the case of earthquakes. On the other side, and this I think is also interesting, there is a big difference between telling to the people just to brace for a big event and stay, at home, and evacuate thousands of people from entire villages. That's a huge logistic challenge, and it also poses, I think, a lot of problems which are really related to the perception of people, which is something that we've been also seeing in the Tohoku earthquake and subsequent, let's say, tsunami, where many people, there was the correct warning, but they just, under evaluated it, and this resulted in huge loss. Maybe another comment from my side is also the fact that besides this particular event now in Germany, in general, let's say, attribution is a key, and not only attribution to events to climate change, so making somehow explicit the relationship between extreme events and the underlying processes which are related to climate change, but also attribution to impacts to the specific events, because as Gaetano showed, I mean, we already have, let's say, good information about how, let's say, impactful combination of events can be, how impactful single events can be. But for instance, in many cases in the earthquake community, only direct impacts are modeled. And this is really a really bare minimum of the understanding of a real impact of an event such as an earthquake. And when all the impacts could be taken into account, the cost would raise by order of magnitude. And this is even, let's say, and the problem is not only modeling the impacts themselves, but making sure that we can trace the impacts up to 2, 3, 5, or 10 years after the event. Because only by having a real, let's say, a consistent attribution, we can also better understand, let's say, long term, the amount of investment that are really needed. So that is just a comment on my side. Benny, I see you have a hand raised.
Yeah, just a quick comment on the attribution issue. I, of course, very much like attribution studies, in particular for such extreme events, to highlight that climate change will make such events more likely. But at the same time, when you communicate that to others, I would not stress that climate change issue all the time, because we have historic examples of similar events. Of course, climate change makes it more makes it more likely, but then probably it's not a 200-year event, but it takes place every 100 years. It's just more likely, but a similar event could also happen without climate change, and that is probably a message that we could also give out. Yeah, this will happen more often, probably not in your lifetime, but it's also a natural event under non-climate change scenarios. And one last comment, you might think that experiencing such an event would really make you aware of environmental issues and probably climate change. If you look at the votes, because we just had our big election here in Germany, if you look at the votes in this area, in the Ahr Valley, it's all the Conservative Party. It's entirely black. So the black is the color of the Conservative Party. Experiencing such an event does not directly relate to more progressive ideas about policies.
That's a very good point. Thanks. Paola.
Yes, I'm making just a little remark about what we call the risk change concerning the event of Chernobyl, which, as Gianni said at the very beginning, Vaia event was quite impossible to miss. Chernobyl event was quite impossible to hit, because of course we had to give a forecast on a large area for a small event. So after ARPA Lombardia forecast, our civil protection gave an alert, an orange one, which is the third grade of 4, so not the most, but almost, to all the areas affected by ARPA Lombardia forecast. That's to say, the majors were alerted. They knew they had to be ready to activate their local civil protection plan. But of course, the real point where the thunderstorm would hit, it was impossible to find. So we have to work for this kind of phenomena. We have to work on another plan. We have to work on prevention. We have to work on the fragility of our territory, which is really exposed to hydrogeological risk. But this is the real difficulty, because it's very, very difficult to make people understand that they have to prevent. They have, as Gaetano said, we have to spend money to avoid something which maybe will never happen. But maybe it will never happen because we invested money in avoiding it to happen. And this is quite difficult to make them to pass. This message is difficult to pass because, of course, we have not unlimited resources. So we have to focus on what maybe it's now and not on what will be. So I'm not saying that majors are does not understand, but maybe it cannot act in this moment. And the last ring of the chain is people, of course. And the video I showed was made by people which were in the streets, taking videos of the flood. So they didn't run away, they just stayed there and look, there is a flood. So this is another thing we have to work on. When you see a flood, you run away, you don't stay there with your mobile phone and take video of the flood. But of course, this is out of I'm technical, I'm an engineer, this is out of my world, I must say. But we have to work together and to talk. As Gianni said, we went to civil protection, we saved them, we were forecasting an extreme event and they believed us. So it means you had the right communication. And this is our responsibility to give a correct communication of what's happening. And uncertainty is a part of it. If I say there will be a thunderstorm, it doesn't mean you will be affected by a thunderstorm, 100% possibility. There is the possibility, so you must prepare yourself. But it's not easy to make this message pass often. Thank you.
Thank you, Paola. A question, quick one from my side. We saw in the news that in the last days there were again damages and let's say ground effects quite severe related to intense rains like in Belgium and other regions which were previously affected. At which extent this is again related to very intense precipitation or to the fact that much of the debris, much of the rivers haven't been properly cleaned, because I mean it will take anyway probably much more time to do it, so that we should at least even think that especially for this type of small scale intense storms that can repeat themselves actually within few months, there might be a non-linear accumulation of damage and also a non-linear amplification of the effects as a tangible effect of this.
Yes, we have two sides. The rain, which can give birth to this phenomena, but the inner fragility of the territory of our areas is in no doubt. So we have to work on both sides. We have to predict this event as better as we can, but we have also to keep our areas as safe as we can. In July, a few days before Chernobyl event, we had another event in Vaia, and there was a landslide and the road closure, a very ground impact, very, very high. And then we go to analyze data and we said no exceptional rain. So what was the problem there? It was not a transboundary problem this time. It was that the bridge was not built properly. This was the why we had all this kind of problem, a flooding and a landslide. So we have to work on both sides. Rain is not always the reason why these things happen.
Thank you.